China may be the only civilization on Earth that was built by a flood. Rome was forged by its legions. Europe was shaped by knights, castles, and endless territorial wars. But China followed a completely different logic. The force that compelled the Chinese to build a unified, powerful state was not an invading army. It was a river, the Yellow River. For thousands of years, this river burst its banks, shifted its course, and swallowed everything in its path. Without a political system capable of mobilizing an entire society, stable survival along the Yellow River was simply impossible. So the origin of Chinese civilization was not a war, it was a flood control project, a failed one. More than 4,000 years ago, a massive flood ravaged the Yellow River basin for years on end. Farmland drowned, settlements washed away, entire communities scattered across the plain. The man tasked with taming the floodwaters was named Gun. His method was straightforward: build dikes, block the water, force the river to stay in its channel. For a while, it seemed to work. But the Yellow River carries an extraordinary amount of silt. Sediment piled up on the riverbed year after year. The water rose higher. The dikes had to be built higher still, until one day the dikes collapsed. The flood surged back across the plain with even greater force than before. The disaster was worse than anything that had come before it. Gun was executed. But the task of controlling the river did not die with him. The man who took over was his son, Yu the Great. He made a completely different decision. He abandoned the strategy of blocking the water. Instead, he chose to guide it. He led workers from dozens of tribes across the region, carving new channels, clearing tributaries, directing the floodwaters toward the sea. Ancient records say he spent 13 years away from home. Once he passed close enough to see the roof of his own house. He could hear his child crying inside. He stood outside the door for a moment, then turned and walked away. 3 times he passed his home. 3 times he kept going. The story became a moral symbol, a man who sacrificed his private life for the public good. But its deeper significance is structural. Flood control was not a task any single tribe could accomplish. Digging channels required massive labor. Different regions had to cooperate. Someone had to coordinate, command, and allocate resources across vast distances. In other words, taming a flood was, by its very nature, a project that required a state. Many historians believe this kind of large-scale, cross-regional mobilization was one of the key forces behind the formation of China's earliest state structures. Not war, a flood. If every historical course of the Yellow River were drawn on a single map, the result would be startling. The Yellow River is not a fixed river. It behaves more like a restless dragon wandering across the plain. Over the past several thousand years, it has shifted course dramatically, sometimes flowing north into the Bohai Sea, sometimes veering south to hijack the Huai River's path to the ocean. The 2 most extreme courses lie hundreds of kilometers apart. A city on the riverbank could become a landlocked town within a generation. A fertile stretch of farmland could vanish under silt overnight. For any dynasty, this was not merely a natural disaster, it was a political crisis. Because once floodwaters destroyed the harvest, landless farmers had a tendency to become something else entirely: rebels. This is why every dynasty in Chinese history treated flood control as a matter of supreme national importance. During the Warring States period, the state of Qin built the Dujiangyan irrigation system on the Min River, combining flood control with agricultural irrigation and transforming the Chengdu Plain into one of China's richest breadbaskets. Around the same time, the Zhengguo Canal dramatically boosted grain production across the Guanzhong Plain. The agricultural surplus generated by these 2 projects gave Qin the economic foundation to conquer and unify all of China. Hydraulic engineering was national power, and in this case, the equation was almost visible to the naked eye. But floods do not only build nations, they also destroy them. In the middle of the 14th century, the Yuan Dynasty, founded by the Mongols, had ruled China for nearly 100 years. Social tensions were mounting. Then, the Yellow River burst its banks again, catastrophically. The court decided to repair the river channel. Grand Chancellor Toktoa ordered the conscription of over 100,000 laborers. Many of these men had just lost their homes to the flood. Before they could resettle their families or salvage what little remained, government officials dragged them from the wreckage and marched them hundreds of kilometers to dig mud and haul stone on a distant construction site. Food was scarce, taxes were not reduced. Then, something extraordinary happened. While digging in the riverbed, the laborers unearthed a stone figure, a statue with only one eye. For years, a folk song had been circulating in the countryside. When the one-eyed stone man appears, the Yellow River will rise and the world will turn. No one knows who buried the statue. Perhaps it was planted by followers of the White Lotus sect. Perhaps it was pure coincidence. But for those hungry, furious men who had just been ripped from their ruined homes, it was a sign from heaven. In 1351, the laborers on the river construction site launched an uprising. They tied red cloths around their heads as a marker. History calls it the Red Turban Rebellion. The revolt spread rapidly. Within 2 decades, the Yuan Dynasty collapsed. A new dynasty rose in its place, the Ming. A single flood had rewritten China's history. Zoom out across 4,000 years of Chinese history, and a pattern keeps repeating. Flood, response, mobilization, rise, and fall. In many civilizations, the state was born from war. In China, the state was born from a different necessity, the need to coexist with a dangerous river. Controlling floods required cooperation, cooperation required organization, organization required power. And so piece by piece, a political system capable of mobilizing an entire society took shape. That system became the prototype of the Chinese state. The Chinese spent 4,000 years learning how to live alongside the floodwaters, but the river was never truly tamed. Every time people believed they had it under control, it found another way to remind them of a simple truth. The flood shaped this civilization, not the other way around.